In the UK, how do people react to RFK Jr.?
Um, I wouldn't say
Do
well.
you have the same kind of idiots there?
Hello, and welcome to the Fiction Nonfiction podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, the author of the novel Brotherless Night.
And I'm Whitney Terrell, author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
So, did you see that speech by Robert F. Kennedy Jr. about autistic kids?
Like, which one? I mean, all he does is talk about this.
The one where he claims that autistic kids will never do things like play baseball or go to the bathroom alone or write poetry.
Oh yeah, I saw that one. That one pissed me off because
Only that one?
Well, no, okay, that one among many others, but I guess it's been most recent. And I have, in fact, I was playing dumb there. I've seen a lot of social media posts about it, and look, I'm a teacher, unlike that guy. And I teach creative writing. I've had amazing writers who are autistic in my classes, and they were definitely way better at writing than him.
Me too. I mean, of course, not all neurodivergent people are good at writing.
Not all neurotypical ones are either, I would say, judging from my creative writing professorship time.
Exactly, which is why it's very bizarre to watch the actual Secretary of Health and Human Services. Oh God, like my entire body is rejecting that he is that position. It's really hard to watch him talk about a very important issue like autism, which he has sadly been talking about like with all sorts of falsehoods for years, and repeat in nearly every word he says damaging and dangerous misconceptions that have been afflicting the neurodivergent community for years, if not centuries.
Which is why we've invited Jodie Hare to talk to us about the future of neurodiversity and the political climate surrounding neurodivergent communities.
Jodie Hare is the author of the book Autism is Not a Disease: The Politics of Neurodiversity. Jodie, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Very excited.
So, how did you discover that you were autistic?
So it was quite a long process for me. Growing up, as a teenager, kind of experienced quite a lot of mental health problems, of kind of differing severity. And I kind of cycled through a number of mental health diagnoses that sort of sometimes gave me a bit of an understanding of myself, but often kind of left me feeling that something still didn't quite make sense, or there were still things I was struggling with, and I couldn't always understand why. And I reached a point in my 20s where I ended up in a psychiatric ward for a month. And it was kind of there that I had a conversation with a doctor. And we kind of, I had, but just by chance, discovered an article by a woman who had had the same diagnosis as me and understood and come to learn that she had been misdiagnosed. And rather than having borderline personality disorder, she was in fact autistic. So I brought this up with my own psych team and we talked it through and the kind of possibility of me also being autistic and kind of discussed my childhood and where things might come together in that new light. So I was put forward for a diagnosis at the age of 20, and then I spent 3 years on the waiting list for the NHS, and I was diagnosed at 23.
So, of course, you write a little bit about that period of your life in the book. And you also talk a lot about the term neurodiversity, which I think I teach at a university. And that's probably the educational system is, I think, the context in which I first encountered that term. Can you tell us a little bit about the origins of that term and what it means to you?
Yes, absolutely. So, neurodiversity itself, kind of before it had kind of a clearer name, originated in a lot of online autistic spaces where autistic people were kind of seeking community and a way to understand themselves in the context of the wider world and their own experiences. And that was kind of things like Martin Jecker's independent living on the autism spectral email list, but it was also kind of in-person events such as Jim Sinclair's Autism Network International. And it was in these spaces that they kind of began to understand themselves in the context of disability and disability theory and disability politics, and kind of coined a term that would help understand the complexities of the lives that autistic people live, but also different ways of understanding neurotypes and the cognitive function that exists amongst humans. And it was Judy Singer who kind of took that those conversations and kind of turned it into published work and took it into academic settings, and that's really where the term kind of took off.
So also one of the things I really liked about the book is that you talk about the politics of that term and why that term is important and has political meaning. So I wondered if you could explain how the political ramifications of using that term are for you, and then read to us a section from the book about this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think kind of a lot of people's key understanding of neurodiversity is the fact that it's a diversity of neurotypes. It's understanding that amongst humans there is a breadth of cognitive functioning, and that all of those functioning types are valid, and those are functioning types that might be acquired from birth, or they might be acquired later in life through things like injury, brain injury, etc. But it's understanding that those things are all human, and essentially it's a paradigm and a lens through which we can oppose the current paradigm, which seeks to pathologize those things. So, reading from the book, I say, so neurodiversity rejects the alienation and ostracization of anyone who is deemed to exist outside the scope of medical norms, refusing the coercion of any individual towards those norms. Neurodiversity offers us the opportunity to subvert these norms, specifically to subvert neuronormativity. It allows us to question and destabilize the fantasy that there are normal and abnormal ways of thinking and being. So essentially, neurodiversity is a way to question the idea that there are some brains that are more normal than others. And now I'm going to read from the book. So, neurodiversity rejects the alienation and ostracization of anyone who is deemed to exist outside the scope of medical norms, refusing the coercion of any individual towards those norms. Jessie Meadows, writer and host of the Disorderland podcast, explains that we must not ignore neurodiversity's opposition to binaries. Neurodiversity is not a nice euphemism for autism, and it's about far more than just fighting negative connotations. Neurodiversity is a paradigm, a lens through which we look at human neurology, and it stands in opposition to the pathology paradigm. This paradigm opposes every medical quest for a cure, asking us to think about what it means to decide that ridding the world of a minority group is a positive or worthwhile goal. As Nick Chown explains, no valid case has yet been made that the health of the social body requires the amputation of the autistic parts of the body. What do people hope to gain through the eradication of autism or neurodivergence? What will the world lose if that aim is ever achieved? Who has the authority to decide which lives deserve to be lived? Understanding autism and neurodiversity as deficits reinforces what is considered normal in society, a concept that has defined our social lives for as long as humans have existed. It is the socially constructed hierarchy of human existence that creates the imbalances of power that so many people are affected by today. Rich versus poor, man versus woman versus non-binary person, heterosexual versus homosexual, neurotypical versus neuroatypical. These are all categories that are awarded cultural value and used to justify or ignore oppressive treatment. Neurodiversity offers us the opportunity to subvert these norms, specifically to subvert neuronormativity. It allows us to question and destabilize the fantasy that there are normal and abnormal ways of thinking and being.
Thank you so much. So that maybe brings us to Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s recent speech, and maybe Robert F. Kennedy in general. I would love to never arrive at Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but here we are.
Well, he seems very desirous of amputating that part of the human beings from the social register.
Yes.
Anyway.
So in his recent, it was a news conference, he said this about people with autism. This is a quote. These are kids who will never pay taxes, Kennedy declared. They'll never hold a job. They'll never play baseball. They'll never write a poem. They'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted. We have to recognize we are doing this to our children. So these are his comments, his ludicrous comments. Could you just talk generally about how the neurodivergent community has reacted to this?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think first and foremost, a lot of the reaction comes from validity. There are a lot of autistic people who will do all of those things, some of those things, one of those things, and not the others. And a lot, there is a deep misunderstanding of amongst masses of the general population of what autistic lives actually look like, and the fact that they look very different in very different cases across the world. I think there is a kind of undermining of the kind of lives that autistic people can live, and the joy that they can have access to, the things that they can achieve, the things that they can, do with their lives. And but I think also on the flip side of that, there are, of course, high support needs, autistics with high support needs who, will need 24/7 care for the rest of their life, who will never be able to have a job. And I think there's quite rightly a lot of anger around the kind of conversation, because it comes down to a question of why does that make their life any less worthy or valuable? If there are autistics who, will need that support for the rest of their lives, they are just as deserving of that care, that love, that right to life as an autistic who can work, who can write a poem. And I think there is just a general, I think it's a very big question of, he is trying to decide who deserves access to life, he is trying to define what a good life looks like, and trying to undermine people who don't fit in the categories that he has predetermined. And I think that's a huge issue for more than just autistic people, but specifically those.
It's been interesting to see like the variety of reactions online, because of course, I think, that quote, our particular version of that quote came from a Mother Jones article. And then there were also people who would, interviews with autistic poets, or, Rashida Tlaib posting on X about her autistic child who is on his third book, actually, which was really interesting to see. And then, as you say, like, I have some severely autistic relatives who are high support. And then, yeah, like that whole range, the range seems unintelligible to people, or I mean, he's sort of intentionally like flattening it in this way that, I mean, it's also one of the reasons that it's so astonishing to hear this rhetoric from him, is of course because he comes from a family that has this complex history with disability, that, where of course, like members of the family who were subjected to, I mean, I'm trying to think of, maybe either of you can remember this, is Rosemary Kennedy, who was subjected to a lobotomy. And then also they're the family that founded the Special Olympics, and his whole family is reacting to this with such anger, in the way that his words are really offensive, and they're also I feel like tarnishing a legacy of like deep thought and contribution to visibility for disabled people in the US in particular, in a way that I find really it's really frustrating. And the fact that he now has this position and really no credibility at all, and is somehow still spouting off. But here we are. In the UK, how do people react to RFK Jr.?
I wouldn't say well.
Do you have the same kind of idiots there?
Yes and no. I think there's I think there is an underlying thought that, he is in a prime position to share these thoughts, but what upsets me more is I know he is not the only person who holds them. There are a lot of people who frame autistic people as burdens, as broken, as, tragedies that could be prevented. The language that many people use across the world to talk about autistic people is dehumanizing. In the US, in the last couple of weeks, an autistic boy of 17 lost his life because he was killed by police officers just for existing in public as an autistic person. So I think it is so inherently disappointing, because it illuminates just how little care is given towards autistic people, and the oppressive power dynamics that so many neurodivergent people exist under at the moment. I think it's a rejection of autistic people's right to dignity and right to life. And I think that's, why it's so affronting.
What you said there, and the parts of the book that talk about police violence and how it relates to neurodivergent people, reminded me for a moment of the Black Lives Matter era here in the US, when conservatives would say, we don't need to train police better or get them to be less violent. We just need better mental health care. But when it comes to mental health care, actually, we're going to do a crappy job. So I just want to point out how stupid that was that they said that. The one thing that was interesting about, not the one thing, one thing that I really liked about your book was that, you know, it's easy to individually criticize RFK Jr., but many of the things in that quote and many of the things that he says generally are part of a long-standing,
Yeah.
decades, if not centuries old way of thinking about neurodiversity that is connected to capitalism. And I really liked the way that you drove this connection home. That the industrial revolution was where we began to pathologize neurodivergent people. And you quote the writer Micah Fraser Carroll, who describes asylums for people who are quote unquote mentally ill as a way of managing the poor, disabled, and unruly body minds that could not be easily exploited for profit. So could
Mhm.
you unpack this idea for our listeners?
Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, as as the Industrial Revolution begun, disabled people, people who were struggling with mental health up until that point had lived in communities. They had lived with their families. They didn't work, but they were cared for, amongst the people in their lives who loved them. And essentially, alongside the Industrial Revolution, it kind of got to a point where the state powers that be kind of sought to understand who had the ability to perform labor, who had the ability to be, quote unquote, productive in society, who had, something that they could produce, something that could be used to make money out of. And when they realized that there were a lot of disabled people, etc., who weren't making them any money, it became an opportunity to take those people out of their homes and put them into state-funded facilities, and that sort of created a forced binary of who makes money and who doesn't. And what they did, I think there's a book called Health Communism, in which they kind of describe this population as the surplus population, and that's a term that is still relevant today. That is a group that is considered by the state to be non-productive, because they are unable to work for whatever reason. Um, and the state kind of uses that population and targets them for extraction through other industries. So what other ways can we make money through you? And that is things like private care homes, that is things like pharma, that is things like medical insurance, or therapies that cost thousands and thousands of pounds. It is a way to manage and control the population depending on how valuable the state believes you to be.
That just makes me think of Elon Musk and Dark Enlightenment, which is maybe a whole other terrifying podcast episode.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, but going back to RFK Jr. as one must in these circumstances,
I don't
apparently.
know what that is. What are you talking about?
Oh, oh God. Okay. So a friend of mine a few weeks ago was sort of like, Sugi, how much darker, how much more into the spiral of our current political cycle do you want to go? And I was like, well, go ahead, lay it on me. Tell me what you're going to tell me. So he was telling me about how Elon Musk is an adherent to a philosophy known as Dark Enlightenment, like a movement. And it is about essentially like a theory that this huge chunk of the population is useless, like
Okay.
they're not needed for work, et cetera. And that his investment in things like Neuralink is sort of like part of a plan to just like offload us. Um, and
Same old shit then. Okay, I got you.
yeah, it's the same old shit with like a very specific name. And so I think like various other oligarchs are also adherents to this dark enlightenment thing. Um and Jodie, you're nodding, and
It's a repackaging of old ideas, I think. That is, it continues. It's yeah.
yeah, it seems in the current context slightly cult like, but so going back to RFK Jr., his banana speech kind of predates by many years his obsession with finding a quote cure or a cause for autism, which was one of the many reasons that many other people tried to prevent his appointment to his current position. And he has suggested that vaccines might be the cause. We'll get into that in a minute. But in your book, you discuss how the idea of finding a quote cure or cause for autism has led to some dark places and dark policies. And I wonder, can you talk a little bit about that history?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I think it's key to remember that the diagnosis itself of autism has only, existed for about a century. It's not a super old diagnosis. But essentially, pretty early on from its inception. There was a quest to cure these things. Hans Asperger, it has reportedly sent thousands of disabled children and autistic children to their deaths. Um, for not, meeting the quote unquote Nazi ideal of a child. And that kind of desire to eradicate autism or autistic people in general has continued. It is a scaremongering around autistic lives, and the kind of desire to eradicate that has led to cures that have included, well, quote unquote cures, sorry, should I say, because there is absolutely no proof that any of these work, nor have they done. Things like electric shock treatment, things like bleach treatment, things like exorcisms, ABBA therapy, which has in the past included slapping and, violence towards children when they behave in ways that are seen as, supremely autistic and therefore in need of removal. It is a constant desire and a constant research area of research that has money funded, pumped into it, non-stop, um, in search of a way to eradicate autistic people. And to this point, all of it has failed. There has been, there is no research, there is no treatment that has been done that has been proved, a cure for autism. And I think, it's
So
kind
he's
of
not going to find a cure by September. And first of all, the idea of finding a cure is
is
itself
ridiculous.
a
Yeah,
bad idea. It's really a form
yeah.
of discrimination, the concept of it, right? Isn't that what you're saying?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think it's it's who has the authority to decide whose lives are worth living? I think that's what it comes down to. Who has the right to decide that autistic people don't deserve to continue their lives? I think, that is the bottom line.
And
I'm
I want
sorry.
Mm.
to go ahead, Whit.
I'm one more dumb. I just think about how many. This guy is just a box full of dumb things. He does not stop. Also, there's this. He mentioned that same speech. And I just want you to comment on this because I think that this seems self-evident. I've seen people talk about it on social media, but like he's keeps insisting that there's been a rise in autism. Is there any evidence for this? Actual scientific evidence for it?
No. There is evidence that there are more diagnoses, and what that comes down to, in terms of research, is that we have a greater understanding of autism. We
Like
have a
you
great,
were misdiagnosed for a significant portion of your life.
yeah, and I know a lot of autistic people who have lives that look very similar to mine and have had that same diagnosis journey. I think what we have is we have reached a point where we know better, we have better knowledge, we have better ways of communicating that knowledge, and we are identifying, more people who need support when they need it. That is the long and short of it. And I think the idea that, I think Trump said there is a spray that we might be using that's turning people autistic. And just those things are, completely unfounded. There is no research to support that.
My impression is that some of these diagnoses are also the result of increased attention in underrepresented communities that
Yeah.
are traditionally like not really part of scientific research or study, and that attention to communities like that are underrepresented minorities, that a lot of those diagnoses are in that area, which makes sense
Yeah.
to me. And also considering the Trump administration's attacks on DEI, that of course is also part of this complicated and shitty story.
One last
Yeah.
thing. We just have to say this. It's not caused by vaccines, right?
Correct. There is no research that proves for certain that autism is caused by vaccines. The one study that people refer to has been debunked numerous times over the years. People who work in those spaces have also said that the study itself was originally done incorrectly or in poor form. But essentially, yes, there is no proof, no research that shows that vaccines cause autism.
I thought your book was really helpful because it made me understand better why people cling to that, why neurotypical people cling to that particular explanation because they want to perpetuate the idea that there's a cure. They want to perpetuate this idea that this is somehow not a different cat, like it is like fixable. It's like they would be normal if they, no, these people, instead of accepting the people for who they are and how they are, this is a way of skipping over that step.
Yeah, absolutely. I think actually providing autistic people with dignity and humanizing them and believing that they deserve the right to a good life as much as non-autistic people would require a lot of people to interrogate the way that they see the world. It would ask them to interrogate their ideas of normality, what they consider right and wrong, what they consider to be a good life. And a lot of people, don't want to do those things. And therefore, it's much easier to say, autistic people are broken. How can we fix them?
We're talking about the ways in which people are kind of misunderstanding, misapprehending the nature of autism, its incredible range. And in your book, you also warn about a newer danger. I thought this section was so interesting, that we may be beginning to view autism as a kind of superpower or a way to be more efficient. And early in the book, you mentioned Rain Man, which was probably the first depiction of autism I ever saw when I was a little kid before I met any of my autistic friends or family. Would that be kind of a good example of what you're talking about there with the superpower?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, especially in the UK and kind of in the context of neoliberalism, there is a kind of pressure to think about how can we make money off of autistic people? If we're going to be more accepting of them, how can we use them? So there is a kind of push towards there are people like the financial papers who are saying, oh well, if you hire more autistic people and accept them, you can boost your profits by such and such. So there is a kind of, we are at risk of trying to move in the right direction and pushing too far the other way, and that it becomes there's at risk of, we need to reach a point where we say it's okay if autism is just autism as it is. It doesn't mean that it has to be a superpower. It will continue to be a disability for many people, but that doesn't mean that being disabled means your life is any less worthy or valid than anybody, or valuable than anybody else. I think the kind of depictions like Rain Man are very specific, and there's been a lot of instances where those films are made or written by people who, aren't autistic or don't know any autistic people or have access to autistic communities. And I think we are beginning to see shifts in that. There are books, for example, in the UK called that I really like, called A Kind of Spark. There's also a lot of autistic people who kind of recognize themselves in characters that were perhaps created not necessarily to be autistic, but just by the nature of how they were written, end up being seen as quite autistic. So there's things like the Heartstopper show on Netflix. There's quite a few characters in that, particularly people like Isaac, who the autistic community refer to as autistic headcanons. So that's a way to kind of say, like, I recognize myself in this character. And I think it's a really nice opportunity that autistic people are beginning to see themselves reflected in the media that they consume.
So, as I was referencing earlier, President Trump has been launching various assaults on DEI programs that mandate accessibility for people with disabilities here in the US. And I mean, the US has long been, we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. I mean, in some ways, like, we have been a destination for people with disabilities to feel like they're going to be, that they have some basis in the law for equal treatment. You have a section in the book titled "What Should Be Done." So, what should be done?
I think that this is a huge question. We could go on for hours about this, and there are all kinds of people who have different answers. I think some of the main things that I talk about in the book that I think are worth highlighting are, improved funding for community services for autistic people. That is day centers, that is home care providers, that is supporting families who have autistic children or autistic family members who are high support needs and require that care. And, that care needs to be provided free at the point of service by the state. I think there needs to be improved training around neurodiversity, and that is in all sectors. I think, autistic people need to be able to go to the hospital, to go to school, to go to, the library, and feel that they are entering spaces that are accessible and that they can have their needs met, and communicate with people who will, respond well to that communication. I think there needs to be better funded research that is focused less on cure and more on improving quality of life, and understanding what it looks like for an autistic person to live a good life, to live a life that is, wonderful and joyous, and not and without threats to safety, and that sort of thing. I think there needs to be a general improvement in accessibility for all public spaces, and that's also particularly relevant in terms of work, because in places like the UK, only 20% of autistic people are in work. I think there needs to be an improved benefit and welfare system, because the nature of autism is the fact that it is a disability, and there are people who won't ever be able to work, but they still deserve the right to a good life, and they need the money to do so, the money to live off. I think there needs to be an interrogation of the underlying ableism that impacts so much of our society, our living, the way that we see people. And I think we need to kind of combat a lot of the abuse that autistic people face, and see them as humans who are deserving of life and care and dignity, and yeah, humanity. I know that's only a few small things to ask for, but that would be a good starting point, I think.
Thank you so much, Jodie. I want to squeeze in one last question because I'm always curious about this. I mean, your book provides so much helpful historical and political context around the way that we talk about this. And I always kind of hate I often get asked, well, if you could recommend one book on the topics that you care about, what would it be? I don't want to ask you to recommend one book. I would love to ask you to recommend a few things that, like, starting points for our listeners who would like to explore this topic more.
Yeah,
Either
absolutely.
writers or books.
Yeah. So let me think. Okay, so Nick Walker, she wrote a book called Neuroqueer Heresies, and she is the writer who kind of introduced the idea of neurodiversity as a paradigm that opposes the pathology paradigm. So that would be a starting point. There's also Dr. Devon Price, and he has multiple books, actually, I believe, that are related to autism. I think Unmasking Autism is a good one. And in terms of understanding a deeper history of capitalism and how we've reached the point that we have in terms of neurodiversity, I would recommend Dr. Robert Chapman's book, and their book is called, oh, oh God. I'm completely.
We'll look it up and we'll put
Yeah,
it in
that's
the
okay.
show notes.
We'll
You
find
can't
it.
have
We'll
to-
find it.
We wouldn't be
That's
able
all
to
right.
remember all this stuff. That was
Yeah.
very impressive.
Thank you so
And
much.
one book that, Jodie, thank you, yes, for joining us, and a book that we'll recommend to our listeners is your book, Autism is
Thank
Not a
you.
Disease, The Politics of Neurodiversity, which they can pick up at their local bookstore. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.